Hello everybody, this is Fun Police and I want to wish you all a happy new year. This is going to be the first video that comes out in 2022 and we are going to take a look at a interesting deck today. This was a deck that originally came around with the release of Legions as people attempted it, but it fell off for quite a while. However, in recent times, the overall archetype has crept its way back a little bit into the meta. Although it's not a dominating force, it is an actual deck that people find success with and take even to the higher end tournaments. Of course, I am talking about the ramp archetype for the US. The release of World at War gave a British ramp deck some legitimacy, namely due to the fact that Britain was very good at defense and could benefit from the ramp being able to reach its win cons and having powerful late game options such as the B-17 alongside its standard roster. However, for today, we're going to take a look at a US ramp deck, which is going to be having the Polish ally to make use of legions. The general biggest weakness of US-based ramp decks is oftentimes their lackluster control options. Very much US lacks guards, it lacks a lot of healing, it has some in there, but it's not as much as other nations, and it also lacks just removal. And as such, the US ramp decks often use their ally to fill that slot. That's why you see a lot of the better ramp decks, namely the Italian and the British versions. Those are, I would say, superior even to this deck because they do have very strong tools. However, I personally find the Legion version to be a lot more enjoyable because the Legions often provide their own set of win cons, especially with some of the tools that the US can make access to, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But it allows for the deck to be a bit more aggressive and actually apply some pressure on the enemy in the early to mid game if the enemy is playing passively. With that said, let's move on to just talking about the various cards. To start off, we have the M93 JASCO. This is a very basic elite that fits into pretty much all ramp decks. Being a 1-drop, it can come down early and significantly reduces the amount of damage that your HQ takes. If the enemy cannot do anything against this, you often will gain, your HQ might as well have 30 or even 40 HP. And that's a very powerful effect. Now, most decks do have ways to remove JASCO, or have ways to get punch through it, but they're spending those resources dealing with your 1-drop while you're ramping into bigger, better things, and it can act at worst as a speed bump. Also has some utility against combo decks like Japan Resistance, where if you're able to save this for the absolute late game, the turn they try to combo off, you could potentially force them to not have the damage output. Now, they do have ways to deal with this, but, due to the Legions, we're actually going to be able to maybe pressure those decks a bit better and make it so they don't have any tools to remove it. But it is just a smaller upside of it. Then we move on to probably one of the most important cards within ramp, War Machine. This is your basic ramp effect. You're able to move from 2 credits to 4 credits, which allows you to turbocharge and skip the early game, which just is one of the biggest benefits of ramp. You're able to get to your big stuff faster, and War Machine is almost always one of those cards you want to see in the opener. Then we have Air Defense. Air Defense is a very solid defensive tool. At 2 credits, being able to deal 3 damage is often enough to kill most early game units, and when the enemy if the game goes long, many control decks are running large air units, which Air Defense just destroys outright. Being able to block something like, say, a Shiden, or say one of the big Lancasters, or enemy B-17s, or whatever else, is actually just really, really strong and gives Air Defense a very solid use pretty much in most ramp decks. U.S. Military Research is the next card, and this offers both flexibility and a bit of a win con. The first effect of depth charges is essentially making this into a ramp card. Your HQ cannot be attacked because it gains smokescreen, and you gain a credit slot. It's not the best use, but against something like aggro, it can be the thing that saves you. You also have the penicillin, which is a potentially big board pusher. Being able to turn your board into an almost unkillable mess is potentially quite strong, on top of having a refill. Although this deck does have a lot of cards, plus 6 defense is just a lot. However, the big thing is actually the Manhattan Project. Being able to get 2 6-credit board clears is very powerful, and add on to that also 2 board-based 12 damage for 12 credits, and that's a really powerful effect. Very often it is best to look to just rush for Manhattan Project. However, don't always ignore penicillin, because of our legions, we often have a bigger board presence than, say, other ramp decks, which in turn gives us some extra benefit where we can sometimes build up a moderate board, against something like, say, British Control, which doesn't really have a way to deal with gigantic, 10 health units outside of single target removal. And if we can make a couple legions alongside some bombers or whatever else into gigantic game-ending threats, that can win games much faster than Manhattan Project can. The only thing I would avoid is the pressurized cabin. The B-29 is just not a good elite, and although high-altitude bombing is good, you're paying a lot for it, and it's just overall not worth it. Then we have the M18 HELLCAT. The HELLCAT is very simply a very effective card. You're paying 4 credits to deal 4 damage to something in the front line, or you pay a little bit more to move it in to move and attack something in the back line. It can hit enemy HQs. It does double damage to tanks, meaning it can kill pretty much most tanks in the game. It's very, very flexible in what it does. And as such, it's just one of those cards that won't win you games on its own, but can help to either push you over the edge, or get rid of some pesky enemy bomber or something that you absolutely need to remove on the cheap. It's just a very good card overall. Then we have the C-47 SKYTRAIN. After the rework, SKYTRAIN has been showing up in almost every US deck. Presenting an infinite amount of 1-drops is just a really powerful effect, and gives, for a 3-credit card, a very credible, you have to remove this threat that is just really good at what it does. Now, granted, we don't have a lot of 1-drops or a lot of synergies with just random 1-drops. However, that doesn't really matter, because the enemy is still forced to deal with this, as if they ignore it, the SKYTRAIN is going to continually fill our board with stuff and allow us to just have some extra units kicking around, which maybe we can buff up or can just help contest the front line, and it's a big hassle if the enemy doesn't deal with it. So it's just a very solid card overall. Next up, we have our first Polish card, the PZL-23. It is very simply, the Karas is a proc for our legions. Because of its effect, you're able to get 2 intel cards guaranteed out of this. And it's reasonable to assume that occasionally you'll get even a third or even a 4th intel card, which gives the deck a lot of additional intel options because of our limited core slots, alongside the fact that the US sadly does not have any intels within its nation. It's important for the Karas to essentially double up on intel activations and procs. Outside of that, it is also providing a steady amount of draw, because Section 2s are allowing you to steadily draw cards. And that is overall a nice effect, but it is not the most game-ending card, but it is definitely very nice. In fact, we only run 1 copy because we're limited in slots, and we want to fit other more important cards in. Speaking of which, Plan West. Plan West is one of the foundational cards for a Legion package. For 3 credits, you are getting 2 2/2 guards that are going to grow as we play Intel. This has a lot of synergy within it, and at worst, you are paying 3 credits for a 4/4 guard, and that is actually quite strong. It's a very well statted unit, or set of units, I should say, and overall becomes more powerful later in the game when we're able to oftentimes combo this with multiple Intel cards, or even just playing it out as a roadblock while we defend important cards like, say, our big bombers or whatnot. It's a very solid card and the foundation of a Legion deck. Then we move on to a card that comes from World at War, the last expansion. This ORP is a interesting one. Notably, we are going to actually be able to benefit from pretty much everything this card has. Intel 2 is obviously there to help proc our legions and grow them, but the copy a random enemy order is actually quite useful because of our ramp. Because of the status of ramp, we often have a lot of credits to spend, meaning that we can more often than not afford whatever order the enemy gives, and even the biggest and baddest orders are actually pretty easy to afford for us, and being able to steal an enemy carpet bombing or some strong single target removal is quite powerful. And then, to add on to that, this card is also going to be healing our HQ for some amount. Against aggro, the ORP is relatively below average, because it can very realistically copy like a 1-cost order and you heal 1 HP. But most decks, especially slower ones, are running enough big orders that I think it's fair to say that you're often going to be healing at least 4 to 5 HP or defense on your HQ, while also getting that order to spend and buffing your legions. So it does a fair amount of stuff and works well in filling a couple gaps in our deck while still tying into the Legion package. Then we have the P40 N5. The P40 is very simply just a good elite. Notably, this is a very annoying card for aggro if you're able to wrest the board from them or force them to not have an immediate response to it, as it severely cripples any units they deploy, to making them incredibly difficult to actually use. Against spam-heavy decks, the P40 can be game-ending, but otherwise it is more so of a speed bump. But again, a lot of early game for the ramp is just trying to speed bump the enemy enough to where our bigger cards are able to let us recover, and the P40 does that extremely well. In Hour of Need is another ramp card, and is one that is actually really, really powerful. Combined with War Machine, this can allow you to, on turn 2, or on turn 3, I should say, you can play Hour in Need, which allows you to reach 7 credits on turn 4. If you go War Machine turn 2, in Hour of Need, and then you can start having 7-8 credits, in the mid game. And that's a very powerful effect, and gives in Hour of Need a core place within the deck, because we're able to ramp up. There is another option to try out, and that is War Bonds. Due to the nature of War Bonds, it is a bit slower, being a credit cost up, and you'd probably want to look for more 4-drops to fill that gap before you play a War Bonds, but this does indeed draw you a card. So if you feel like you're hurting for card draw, War Bonds can be an effective option. But moving on, we have the Underground State. The Underground State is one of the power cards of Legions, and is probably individually the strongest Polish Legion card within the game. You have the Intel proc, which allows you to buff Legions. It's going to add a Legion on its own, and you also get to bounce an enemy unit to their hand. This allows you to get big threats off the board and force the enemy to replay it, while still buffing your other legions and getting more legions out to buff. All for a simple 4 credits. Underground State serves as a really powerful card, and combined with Plan West, I would say those two make up generally the foundation of an Intel or a Legion-based strategy when you're looking with this US ramp deck. Then we have Stars and Stripes, which is a bit of a tech card. Stars and Stripe is a board clear and does have some good purpose right now, as there is a fair amount of backline-based decks, namely Brit Air and Stars and Stripes, can reasonably come out turn 3, turn 4 due to ramp, and then completely obliterate the enemy backline that they've spent the last 2 to 3 turns building. And this does have a lot of power behind it. One of the biggest things, though, is that this card is not always going to be the most powerful, and when we get done with this overview of the cards, I'll talk about what else you could probably consider running, but this is one of the main flex spots within the deck. We Can Do It, on the other hand, I would say is probably one of the core cards within this version of ramp. Due to the fact that we have a lot of legions, We Can Do It has a lot more targets that it can buffs, and turning legions from 2/2s into 2/5s makes them significantly more durable and also much bigger of a threat, as it means that as we buff them up, they'll become 3/6s or 4/7s or on and on and on, and that becomes very quickly a problem that players are going to have to deal with, and if they don't, they're just going to get overrun. On top of that, it's also providing a little bit of card cycle and also giving us some extra defense to our HQ, which is always appreciated. It's a very strong card, and when combined with even something simple as Plan West, it can offer a lot of a lot of high health guards and make your board just significantly harder to deal with. Then we move on to Mobilization. Mobilization comes in due to the fact that as we are not running Britain, we need a big draw order. If you're playing with the British ally, it is very easy to just run Lend-Lease. However, because we don't have that, Mobilization takes its place. 5 credits for a draw 3 is actually very efficiently statted, and is really easy to play out in a ramp deck. It's overall, there's not a whole lot to say, really. Mobilization is just really good at making sure you don't run out of cards in the mid to late game. The final card for our Polish ally is going to be Uprising. Sort of a signature card. For 5 credits, we get a board clear that is very powerful. Simply put, it only takes usually about 2 or 3 legions dying for Uprising to be a board clear that is able to wipe most boards. And as the game drags on, Uprising eventually becomes usually about 5 credits, destroy the board. Now, it does blow up your own board, which is a bit of a problem. However, if you manage it carefully, it is possible to, for example, use stuff like We Could Do It to kind of negate that damage while still blowing up the enemy board. But it's also possible for ramp to sort of simply blow up the enemy board, blow up whatever meager stuff it has, and then play some big threat on the follow-up, since it is only 5 credits. But this gives us a very important board clear to pair with the other few clears that the US has naturally, and serves very similar roles to something like carpet bombing from Britain. Then we have Strategic Bombing, which is another board clear. It's pretty simple. It's essentially just a carpet bombing for the back line. It does a little bit of damage to the HQ and also knocks a credit down, so the enemy is slowed down a little bit. It's just overall a very solid elite. You see this in pretty much any US deck because it's just very strong overall. And, you know, it's just here as an extra board clear. Then we move on to our roster of late game finishers, starting off with the TBF-1 Avenger. This is one of the 2 iconic cards that you're going to see in ramp, offering a modest-sized bomber, but notably having a very powerful deployment effect, being able to blow up a large enemy unit. Being able to have this to blow up key threats, such as a card like Grenadier Guards, the Churchill AVRE, or even other B-17s, or, you know, a whole myriad of other cards. The Avenger very often has a target, and is only really a weak card against aggro decks, but so are most expensive cards. And as such, the Avenger offers a very effective tool that allows you to precisely hit an enemy key target if you need to, although that does mean that it can miss out on a low target and then not have anything to blow up. But generally that's not a problem, and you can save them to counteract anytime the enemy tries to get something big out. Next up, we have high altitude bombing, which is a very powerful value tool. Being able to pay 1 card and kill 2 enemy units is quite powerful, and when combined with the rest of our units, rest of our orders and big units, it's possible to oftentimes save this for when the enemy has 2 high value targets out, at which point high altitude bombing can be just backbreaking for the enemy. It's very easy to wait if you can successfully wait until the enemy has those 2 high value targets out, or even 2 moderately effective units. For example, like a British control player has an RAF Lightning out and a Grenadier Guards. High altitude is a massive boon there, and it can go up, although it can also go down a little bit. As with most things against aggro, this is not particularly a strong card, although its potential to blow up 2 units can destroy more mid-range styled units that might be resistant to board clears. But overall, it's very much a value card, and knowing when to play it out can actually be a very important thing in the late game. The B-17 serves as our next card and is the most iconic card within US Ramp. It is a gigantic bomber that also just outright kills an enemy when it comes down. This makes it resistant to bounce. It is also difficult to trade into and often demands heavy removal or something like another B-17 to kill it. And as such, the B-17 is just very, very powerful. Although the randomness can be awkward if the enemy's flooded the board with a bunch of little things. However, thanks to our vast amount of board clears and our better ability to trade, it is more reliable for the B-17 to land on a good target. And when it does, it can completely swing the momentum of the match in your favor. Then we reach the B-17F, which is one of our 2 finishers. Being immune to enemy orders alongside having blitz and being just a very big bomber means that the B-17F is not only really hard to deal with, but can end the game often in 2 to 3 turns if it is not answered. Especially because we're able to tuck it behind a lot of guards, the B-17F can prove overwhelming against certain decks and just become a pretty annoying card to deal with. Notably, some decks like British Control just don't really have a way to deal with it outside of very specific answers, which if you can bait out, means that the B-17F could come down and essentially just win the game. And then we move on to our final card, the M26 Pershing. Now, this is a bit of a subjective pick, because there are actually a lot of late game elites for the US that you could put in here instead of the Pershing. However, I personally have enjoyed the Pershing here to give us another giant blitz unit. Being able to have the combination of the B-17 and the Pershing together gives you potentially 14 damage of blitz from hand, on top of the Hellcats, alongside the more aggressive ability, or the ability for legions to also sometimes get damage in. It's reasonable that you're able to essentially put the enemy on a very quick clock with the Pershing, although there are many other options, and which we'll actually talk about right now. Before we get into the replacements for some of the tech cards, let's just quickly cover some of the Polish cards that you may be considering. Obviously, there are a lot of options for Intel cards, but I would say there's only a few options that you would really want to consider. Agency Africa is a potential option, although it is more random, because being able to copy and card in the enemy hand can be really, really good or really, really bad, and potentially competes in the same spot as the ORP, but I think the extra healing and the fact that it guarantees an order is just a little more consistent. You also have potentially adding an extra PZL-23, and that can work. The PZL is a very good way to proc your legions, and if you wanted to replace an ORP, I think that is a very viable option. There is also potentially the M4 Sherman PL, which does work with Intel and doesn't take up Polish slots. It would take up US slots since it is a US exile. However, it just doesn't fit amazingly well with what we need from legions right in this deck. Maybe there is a deck out there, that eventually will want this, but I think we need to see more Intel cards in the US before we start considering the Sherman. But it is potentially a very solid tempo tool. If you can get this out, then you can play an Intel card like something like Underground State, which bounces an enemy unit, and then you have a 5/4 tank that is going to operate for free, either putting a ton of damage on the enemy HQ or potentially allowing you to trade effectively into something else. It's not the worst thing, but I do think that the roster of cards we have right now work better, and you'd need to lean a little bit more into Intel, like having a second Karas in there, in order to have enough Intel to continually make the Sherman worth it. There is also the Tarnow Regiment, and this one is potentially a build around. I'm sure if anybody has played against or have seen the Tarnow go off, you can realize how powerful it is. Whenever you play an Intel card, getting an extra Legion and drawing an extra card is really, really powerful. And Ramp does have the ability to have enough credits to play the Tarnow and play even something like an Underground State with more relative ease than other control decks. The biggest problem is that it is a bit slow in that regard. It is difficult for Tarnow to consistently offer up a defensive tool, notably because when you're saving up to ramp, you're not able to use these cards as a defensive option, which hurts the reason legions are here in the first place. But if you are to do that, I would probably look to cut Plan Wests and maybe the ORPs, load up on the Karas, and see if you can make it a bigger package. But you would definitely probably have to find some other cards to cut in order to make the Tarnow not too expensive and slow the deck down too much. But regardless, let's get into US tech cards. For US options, there are a few things we could consider. Notably, one of the first things I could talk about is the 32nd Infantry Regiment. Although it does not have much synergy within the deck, being able to tutor out a bunch of your 1-drops potentially gives you a very strong, or at least very competent early game. And you're able to better contest aggro decks, and these can even help to just, contest the front line or be extra buff targets for something like We Can Do It. So the 32nd is a good option. The problem is finding those 4 core slots to make the 32nd worthwhile. If we want to add some early game removal, Awoken Giant is potentially a strong option to consider. However, it is quite situational, and due to the existence of stuff like Japan Resistance, can end up being a very dead card at the moment. So it's a bit risky, but it is also decently strong against something like the US frontline decks, especially when combined with our numerous board clears. There is also the Red Devils to consider, which again don't have much synergy like the 32nd, but does have the ability to be very annoying within the front line by taxing the enemy to trade into it and get rid of it. It's just a little bit too unsynergistic, but it is potentially an option if you really want to load up on more anti-aggro stuff. You could also consider a card like Patrol if you're looking for a very cheap form of damage. This one, like Awoken Giant, I would say is a little worse than Awoken Giant, as its effects are largely not important to us, and it's essentially deal 2 damage to an enemy unit, which does have some uses, but it also is a bit situational. Carrier cover is another option to potentially look at. It is a mixture of a bounce option alongside a ramp card. And although you do pay a little bit of a tax for that flexibility, having one or the other does give it a purpose against most decks. For example, if you're running against a board-based deck, the bounce can be very powerful against something like a big guard or some other slow-moving unit. And if you're playing against a deck that is playing too passively, the extra credit slot can help you ramp into bigger things quickly. It's honestly a pretty solid option overall, and you could really look into it. There is also Torpedo Attack, which got buffed a few months ago, and we haven't seen a whole lot of it, but we do very occasionally see it pop up in tournament ramp decks, because it's essentially 3 credits blow something up in the front line. And that can be quite powerful, especially because of our large roster of guards thanks to legions. Torpedo Attack can help us remove big, hard-to-deal-with threats that get into the front line. It's a potentially good option. If you feel like you also want even more draw, the PBY Catalina is still a really, really strong card overall. The only problem is that the Catalina draws maybe a little too much if it sticks around, and granted that is often a good problem to have, but in ramp, sometimes if you end up having the Catalina stick around for too long, then you can start overdrawing cards and burning and milling cards, and that's actually a bad thing, especially in value-based matchups, so there is some risk and some reward to it. The 101st is a potential another option. It's never a bad card. Being able to ping something in the support line and then having a blitz infantry unit that also can be ambushed makes it an annoying enough card and is generally a flexible card. It's not game ending, but it's not something that, you know, is particularly bad either. I've talked about war bonds previously, but this serves a similar purpose. War bonds gains you credit slots and also draws a card, so you get the draw on top of the ramp. But it is slower than in Hour of Need due to the fact that you can't go War Machine on 2 into a turn 3 in Hour of Need. Instead, you have to do turn 2, a War Machine, you have turn 3, you have 4 credits on turn 3, and then on turn 4 you play War Bonds. So later on, War Bonds is overall the superior option, but in that crucial early game, it can be a bit problematic. You could consider a Corsair in the late game as a late game threat. Although it is not the best statted, it is one of the cheapest options, and being able to essentially blow up an enemy unit does make the Corsair potentially a decent threat. You know, you could see it as essentially miniature versions of the Avenger and the B-17, and those aren't pretty good cards. And the Corsair has, over the years, seen at least occasional or serious play within various ramp lists. If you're lacking elites like the B-17 or the Pershing, the Corsair is potentially an option. Another option is the P-51 Mustang. If you have a lot of the other late game elites, the Mustang is less appealing. However, it is a relatively big fighter that can help to deal with an enemy air unit. And that does give it some merit. And potentially you could run it as a 1-of even if you're looking to have some extra air counters. That is a possibility. But if you're on a budget, the Mustang is also one of the better cards to pick up. Then we get on to the options that are that could take the place of the Pershing. The first up is Seaborne Invasion. Seaborne Invasion is a card that serves the best purpose against aggro and other mid-range decks, since you're instantly able to snatch the front line from them and shove 2 infantry units in there. Seaborne can be a very potentially powerful option, especially because we're ramp. You can also occasionally get blitz units, which you can then operate to potentially kill an enemy unit or do various other things like hit the HQ with them. The biggest thing with Seaborne overall is that it is just very solid at getting that front line. But against value-based decks, its value can vary because it does. Sometimes you just don't pull the best infantry, and Seaborn then kind of ends up a flop. There is also the option of mass deployment. Now, depending on who you ask, mass deployment ranges from an okay card to a completely trash one. And I would lean more towards mass deployment is an option you could consider. Against certain decks, mass deployment offers a full board in one card. And because of how much ramp obviously can benefit from it, and it's not unreasonable to potentially be pulling some of the bigger, scarier units like Pershings and B-17Fs from it to, apply a lot of pressure to. It can also be combined with We Can Do It to make the board just nightmarishly difficult to deal with, which does add some extra benefit to it. Combined also with the fact that we have legions to help flood the board, and I think there is a real argument that mass deployment could serve an actual role here. It's especially good against decks that are limited in board clears or are trying to use single target removal to keep you under control. But with that all talked about, those are the variety of options we can look at. And let's just quickly go over the game plan. So in the mulligan, the card you're absolutely looking for pretty much every time is War Machine. War Machine is going to let you skip the early game, which is very important for us to do. If you have a War Machine, then I would recommend looking for In Hour of Need, because being able to go War Machine turn 2, In Hour of Need turn 3 is very, very powerful and one of the biggest strengths of ramp at the moment. However, you can also look for stuff like Plan West, SKYTRAIN, JASCO, and Air Defense, because those are our defensive options early on, and we're able to benefit from those. You could also consider keeping Underground State and the P40 if you have War Machine, because you're able to use them the following turn on turn 3 to disrupt the enemy in some manner. The general game plan is pretty straightforward. Ramp is generally a straightforward deck. You're going to get your credits high, and then you're going to slam down big threats over and over. However, this ramp deck has a bit of a different access to it. If the enemy is playing passively, it is entirely possible to stockpile stuff like Plan West and Karas, and then flood the board real quick, and then use various intel cards to essentially turn the enemy turn your board into an extremely hard to deal with thing, which can put the enemy on the back foot and gives you an extra tool of pressure beyond your late game threats. You're loaded with a fair amount of healing. You have a lot of value, but one of the general things is to never fall too far behind in control. Although you do have Uprising, which gives you a unique option to recover from even really bad situations, you are generally looking to be the one in control of the match after the early game. Use stuff like the B-17 and Avenger to kill off key enemy units. High-altitude bombing can act as a pseudo board clear against a small but very big board. And in general, you're just looking to kind of beat them down. The B-17 Pershing and the Manhattan projects from the research, alongside Hellcats even, offers a lot of damage that can come straight from your hand, which makes it difficult for the enemy to really deal with. And otherwise, that's the deck. So now we're going to jump into a couple games and see how it plays out. And with that, we are almost at the end of this deck tech video. I've thrown in about 5 games, a bit more than I normally do. We'll see if this keeps up, or maybe we'll go back to 3, because this is going to be a bit of an extra long video, and my videos already linger on an hour. Regardless, I hope everybody enjoyed, and I just want to say one last time that this deck is very fun. I personally enjoyed this as one of my favorite versions of Ramp, but it is not exactly the strongest variation. Notably, the British and US variants or the British and the Italian variations, I think are overall a stronger option. Whether that is an actual British Ramp deck or if you're using Britain or Italy as an ally. Just their tools, I think, are overall going to end up better. And although they do have maybe some changes to them, I think what they offer is just a little bit stronger overall and fits better. But I personally enjoy this deck a lot and wanted to share it with you all, especially as we've seen Ramp kind of start to make its return. Otherwise, I want to again wish you all a happy new year. I definitely plan to continue making deck techs and new content. Seemingly this month we are going to be getting a new World at War expansion, so that's exciting to look forward to. But otherwise, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll catch you later.